Hello and welcome to all to this webinar, which is hosted by APA's Division 52 International Psychology. This webinar is part of an ongoing series to celebrate activities of psychologists around the world, to provide useful information for international engagement, and to encourage us all to take a broad and global perspective. My name is Dr. Falou Rami, and I, along with Dr. Karen Brown, are your co-hosts for today's webinar. Before we begin, our online audience have the ability to ask questions by typing them in the chat box located at the bottom left of your screen. Please feel free to type your questions during the presentation. I will be making note of them, organizing them, and during the last 10 to 12 minutes or so, I will present them to Dr. Ray Winbush for discussion. At this time, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Brown as she introduces and welcomes our guest speaker, Dr. Ray Winbush.
Thank you, Dr. Rami. Good morning. I want to introduce to our attendees here, Dr. Raymond Arnold Winbush, also known as Takari Bioko. He is an American African scholar and activist known for his systems thinking approaches to understanding the impact of racism, white supremacy on the global African community. His writings, consultations, and research have been instrumental in understanding developmental stages in Black males, public policy and its connection to compensatory justice, relationships between Black males and females, infusion of African studies into school curricula, and the impact of hip hop culture on the contemporary American landscape. He is currently research professor and director for the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Winbush's consultations, research, and speaking engagements have gained him worldwide visibility. In addition to his diversity workshops, discussions on reparations, and keynote addresses on race relationships now you have to track this because he's done a lot, for Princeton University, Yale University, Harvard University, the Washington College of Law at American University, the Boeing Company, Columbia University Law School, New York University, and others. He has lectured on racism in a global context at Murdoch University in Perth, Western Australia, Amsterdam, Netherlands, and at the University of London School of Education. As a part of his many accomplishments, as if that wasn't enough, Dr. Winbush appeared as a race relations expert on the Oprah Winfrey Show in 2005. It is my pleasure to present to you all Dr. Takari Bioko.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Falou. I'm glad to be here. I think I'm going to do a remake of Aretha Franklin's famous song, Who's Zooming Who, because I just got off another Zoom call a few minutes ago. Thank you for inviting me to this. I bring you greetings from Morgan State University, where I teach. If you like music, we gave the world Denise Williams. If you like business, we gave the world Earl Graves, the founder of Black Enterprise magazine. If you like athletics, we gave the world Leroy Kelly, a running back for the Cleveland Browns in my hometown. But our greatest gift was a sister that graduated there in 1918 from our high school by the name of Zora Neale Hurston, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century and actually one of the greatest writers in American history. So HBCUs hold a major role in the education of Black leadership all over the world. I'm going to try today to combine like 3 different topics in about 20 to 30 minutes. And so then hopefully the discussion of reparations in particularly is something we need to talk about Q&A. So we'll be doing that. So let me see if I can get this screen shared the correct way. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see that. So I'm going to talk today about reparations, mental health, and the African diaspora. This is, to me, one of the most important things, this saying by Neely Fuller Jr. He says, if you do not understand white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it works, everything else you think you understand will only confuse you. I just finished a book. Some of you are familiar with Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, a good friend of mine who recently made her transition. A bunch of us got together with this new book that just came out called the Osiris Papers. Her book is called the Isis Papers. And Dr. Welsing outlined what she calls the 9 areas of racism, white supremacy, based on the work of Neely Fuller. And I want to go through these 9 areas. She is one of the few Black theorists, or she's one of the few theorists that talk about why is there racism. We know that it exists in a variety of forms, but why does it exist? So we know that we have racism in economics. I'm going to run through these 9 areas quickly. We know what redlining is in terms of how loans were made to Black folk for many, many years in terms of not getting loans for housing, businesses, and so forth. We know there's racism in education. I mean, that's probably one of the easiest one to talk about. We could talk about Brown versus Board. We could talk about what is taught to Black, Latino, Native American children, and natives, indigenous people throughout the entire world. So we know there's racism in education. We know there's racism in entertainment and sports. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this picture in the middle that's Gone with the Wind, which HBO recently took down to contextualize it better. There's an image of Serena Williams stomping her racket, I suppose. And the first cover of Vogue that ever had a Black man on it came out a few years ago with LeBron James. I could talk about this cover because the origin of that cover alone says a lot. But we know there's racism in entertainment and sports. There's racism in labor. Who does the hardest work? Most Black folk in this country know that have a relative or had a relative that worked for the post office. That was the most dangerous federal job in the United States that you could have. We know who mines gold in Africa. And this dude here up on the left here, we know that oftentimes in labor, the burden of doing the tough work oftentimes falls upon Black people. We know there's racism and white supremacy in law, Breonna Taylor. We could talk about George Floyd and a variety of other people. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think you know most of this. We know there's racism in politics. I said I was not going to mention the guy's name who occupies the White House. I don't know if any of you know who this is, but this is a woman named Le Pen, who is a white supremacist and is rising up and has actually risen up in France. So racism is a global issue, even in politics. And right there in the corner, the average voting time in the 2012 presidential election, how long it took to vote. We know there's been a suppression of vote, which absolutely did no good for the occupier of the White House this time, apparently. In fact, you know, Black folk have this saying that says, don't start none, won't be none. So when we heard that they were suppressing votes, you know, slowing down the mail, we turned out. So that's another discussion. I could talk an hour on each one of these. We know there's racism in religion. There's a picture of a white guy who people call Jesus. This is an actual photo of a white man who has been exploiting Africans throughout. And this particular photo was taken in Kenya. He claims that he's Jesus. And of course, I shouldn't say of course, but many of the Africans in Kenya have been following him as Jesus. And there's a good book by Catherine Gerber called Christian Slavery, which is an oxymoron when you think about it. We know there's racism and white supremacy in sex. Some of you saw the sketch just 2 weekends ago of whoever this woman's name is from England, Adele. And they were talking about island sex. It got a lot of controversy. A lot of people were offended by it. That just happened 2 weeks ago. Many of you remember this commercial a few years ago about the Cheerios child, as they said, having a Black father and a white mother, and the response by people about that. It was an incredible outpouring of hatred towards that Cheerios commercial. And of course, many, many years ago, Calvin Hurton's book, Sex and Racism in America, is an excellent book to read. We know there's racism, white supremacy, and war. These are photographs of segregated facilities in the American Army as well as in South Africa. Excellent book again, Fighting Racism in World War II. This is Stephen Biko, and he said the most powerful weapon, not one of the most, but the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And as psychologists, and as a psychologist, I believe this is very true. I think that psychology oftentimes wants to work around or avoid all discussions of racism, especially in courses that I teach. I'm teaching a course this semester at Morgan State called Theories of Personality, which is a very common, essential course in psychology. And I take pains, and it's not that much pains, but I take time to talk about the racism that people like Sigmund Freud or G. Stanley Hall expressed in their work. The late Robert Guthrie wrote a book that all psychologists should read called Even the Rat Was White. And so we need to understand as psychologists how racism plays with the mind of Black people. The 9 areas of racism, white supremacy that Francis outlines I believe, created most of the psychological damage that the global African community has experienced. Issues of self-hatred, negative images of ourselves, pathological forgiveness of those who hurt us, and what I just call the vulgar materialism. We heard 50 Cent a couple of weeks ago said that he was going to vote for Trump because he didn't care if he hated Black people. But 50 was saying, I make over $400,000 a year, therefore I'm going to be voting for Trump. Otherwise, Biden will raise my taxes. But I'm trying to steer away from the politics for this. So what has not been studied deeply is the behavior of those who have enslaved us, raped us, ate us. And I literally mean ate us. The book by Vincent Woodard on the right-hand side called The Delectable Negro came out a couple of years ago. I was shocked when I read it. It was recommended to me by one of my colleagues that white people on American plantations literally often ate Black people. They cannibalized them. You should read this book. It's a very disturbing book, but I think something that people should read to understand the behavior of people classified as white. Michael Bradley has written this book, Iceman Inheritance. My friend and colleague Marimba Ani wrote Yurugu, and The Psychopathic Racial Personality by Bobby Wright. Bobby and I finished our PhDs at the University of Chicago together. But all 4 of these books, and there's a handful of others, not many, that studies the behavior of the people that have done some of these things to people of color all over the world. This is from Australia. This is from the Congo, where some over 10 million Africans were killed in the Congo under the reign of Belgium for many, many years, and their hands were cut off. These are actual pictures of children and people who were paid to cut off the hands of other people and by other tribes to divide them up among themselves. This is the Mau Mau in Kenya, who were colonized and hurt by the British. They recently settled a lawsuit in Great Britain about the treatment of the Mau Mau during the Kenyan Revolution. And of course, how could we forget the United States of America? I'll just push these in silence. Some of the images. George Kennedy, one of the youngest person ever executed in the United States for a crime that he did not commit, but being accused of raping a white girl in the 1940s. And he was executed at the age of 14. So much of what I'm saying today is in the revised edition of my book, The Warrior Method, which you can get any place. That's not a class political advertisement or anything like that. But in Warrior Method, I say that we should, things that will keep a Black person, and it's not just Black people, but mentally healthy in this society, is to maintain deep political involvement with the African community. One of my colleagues in Florida, Naeem Akbar, found out that Black folk who live beyond the age of 80 have a long history of political involvement. In other words, being involved with your community at a political level actually is good for your mental health. John Henry Clark, you should possess a deep and abiding knowledge of global African history. These are things that I believe that help us mentally as people of color, and specifically Black folk. Usually during February, the people that are up on the bulletin board during Black History Month are Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass here in Maryland, of course. Malcolm X just got up there because he was sanitized in the 90s by Spike Lee's film and so forth. But most of us don't go beyond that in deepening ourselves in understanding the history of Black folk, which can be inspirational and again, keep one mentally stable. Another thing that I recommend is that all of us read at least 30 minutes a day about African culture and or life. And I believe the systematic reading is best. I'm in the process of reading Kwame Ture's Stokely Carmichael's autobiography, which he wrote during the last 18 months of his life, called Ready for Revolution. And I'm learning a lot. I did not know, for example, that Stokely was taught by Toni Morrison when he was a student at Howard University. So making those kind of connections and understanding, and especially reading to your children. And if you don't have children, read to your grandchildren. And most importantly, read to yourself. And what I call avoid being a super slave. Some of you recognize these people: Omarosa, Ben Carson, who lives here in Baltimore, Clarence Thomas, who lives in the Supreme Court, and Stacey Dash, who made a film called Clueless, and she remains that way. Furnish your home with African art and cultural objects. If I walk into a home of a person of color, it should reflect their culture. You wouldn't expect, for example, that the occupier of the White House would come out in a dashiki, and when I go to your house, I should know that I'm surrounded or that this is a Black home. I once sold a home in Nashville before I moved to Baltimore, and the white realtor, when she saw my house, she said, "This house is not going to sell." And I said, "Why?" She said, "They're going to know it's a Black home." And she wanted me to take away my cultural objects. And I told her I wasn't going to do that. The house sold a week to a young white male hipster. And she apologized for even telling me that. But a home should reflect your culture. I really believe that. And attend African-centered faith communities. If you go to church, a mosque, a temple, or a place of worship, it should reflect your culture. It should reflect what I call your spiritual nationalism. And I think that if you're in a church or anything with images of a white God or white Jesus hanging up over places, you're in the wrong place. And I'll talk about some of that when we do the Q&A period. So essentially, what the global African community has been doing since 1441, when the first enslaved Africans were taken out of Africa, is repairing the damage. And I'm putting that nicely. I usually say cleaning up the mess the Europeans have done to our communities in the diaspora. So in the lower left-hand corner, you see the Tuskegee experiments. most of you know, where they withheld cures for syphilis from Black men and just gave them placebos. Black literacy or illiteracy, drugs, enslavement itself, all of these things, what is occurring now, have to do with the issue of Black folk trying to repair the damage. So I've been a strong advocate of reparations. I've written a couple of books about it. This is one of my favorite phrases from Ralph Wiley. He says, "Give me the free labor of one Black person for 1 year, I would be a rich man. Give me the free labor of a dozen Black people for 12 years, I would be a very rich man. Give me the free labor of millions of Black people for 250 years, I would be America." So a definition of reparations is a payment of a debt owed to atone for wrongdoings, to make amends, to make one whole again. The payment of damages to repair a nation, compensation in money, land, materials, or damage. That's the definition from the NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations America, which is the oldest group pressing for reparations in this country. Okay, let's see if we can go to the next slide. Just 1 minute. I think I'm stuck someplace. Okay, let me see if I can pull that back up. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Slavery is considered by the UN and other international groups as a crime against humanity, very important, for which there is no statutes of limitation. You can't say, well, we did this 200 years ago. If it involved just one of these 9 areas, I'm not going to read them all. But
Dr. Bianco, can you go ahead and share your screen again?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Let's see. Okay, can you see?
There we go. Got it. Thank you.
Sorry about that. This is Zoom technology. Slavery is considered by the UN and other international groups as a crime against humanity. The UN considers if any of these 9 things were committed on a mass level, it would be considered a crime against humanity. So you can answer yes to all of this with regards to enslavement of African people. Were we murdered and exterminated? Yes. Enslaved? Yes. Deportation outside of the country or the continent? Yes. Imprisonment, torture, rape, inhuman acts. You should read about J. Marion Sims, the father of American gynecology. And one reason why gynecological research was so advanced in the United States was that he had a ready supply of Black women that he literally experimented on relative to gynecological thing, and the whole world would come to this place, United States, to talk about it because he could experiment on Black women. So all of these things have actually happened to Black people. So some examples of reparations that have been given: $1 billion to the Alaska Natives, the people you may erroneously call Eskimos. The Lakota people of South Dakota have had reparations, or a form of reparation. $81 million to the Klamath of Oregon. And just a few years ago, under that very radical President Ronald Reagan, $1.2 billion for Japanese Americans who were interred and incarcerated during World War II. So opponents to reparations say things like reparations are going to divide the races even further. Why can't we just leave the past alone? Can we just all get along with each other? I call that the Rodney King argument. So I believe that we have always been divided as a nation on the issue of race because we have not looked honestly and truthfully at the horrors of enslavement and its aftermath on all Americans. We just haven't done it. And so, people will ask me, Ray, can we have a racial reconciliation discussion by you? And so reconciliation implies on a personal level, two people loved or were conciliatory to one another at one time, and that a breach occurred in that disrupted the relationship. And the couple, because of their damaged love, wished to become reconciled again. Racial reconciliation is impossible without reparations. The original sin of the United States is racism and is mutant child enslavement. It is a sin for which the U.S. has never apologized nor made amends. And we can talk about how reparations have never really been apologized in the United States. That's another discussion. But we'll talk about Africans in America and white Americans are told to forget about slavery, move on, and put the past behind. So racial reconciliation implies that at one time the relationship between Black and white folk in the U.S. was loving and conciliatory, and that a breach occurred and disrupted the relationship. And many people don't like me saying this, but it's the truth. There's never been a time when Africans in America and white Americans have been conciliatory towards one another. So usually people will say, well, Dr. Winbush, what about the civil rights movement? Viola Louisa, John Brown, 150 years ago. First of all, people consider John Brown as being crazy. And secondly, the racial reconciliation and cooperation that occurred during the civil rights movement, and that is occurring now with Black Lives Matter banners every place in this country. The only time that white people have ever fought white people on behalf of Black people was during the American Civil War, the North against the South. I have told people very recently that the only people that you should look at the Black Lives Matter white participants as being extra and temporary, but don't look at it as being permanent. We can talk about that later too. So there's 4 stages of reconciliation. You have to apologize, you have to investigate and account for what happened. The 3rd stage is actually reparations. And then the 4th stage is prosecution of the wrongdoers, which is, optional. What I would like to do now is read, and I'll end on this note. This was a letter written from a Jordan Anderson. It was written to P.H. Anderson, who was a colonel in Big Spring, Tennessee in 1865. And the condition, this is right after the Civil War, and the conditions of plantation were in trouble. So Jordan Anderson, who was enslaved to Colonel Anderson, he and his family moved to Dayton, Ohio. And Colonel Anderson asked him to come back to the plantation to help him straighten out things. And this is the actual letter. I'm going to read portions of it, and then I'll end here, that Jordan Anderson wrote Colonel Anderson when he got the letter. So he says here, to my old master, Colonel P.H. Anderson, Big Spring, Tennessee. Sir, I got your letter and was glad to find that you had not forgotten Jordan and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else. I have often felt uneasy about you. Now, Black folk call that signifying. He didn't say you must be crazy to think that I'm coming back or anything else like that. He said, I have often felt uneasy about you. I thought the Yankees would have hung you long before this for harboring Rebs they found at your house. I want to know particularly what the good chance is you promised to give me. I am doing tolerably well here in Dayton, Ohio. I get $25 a month with victuals, that's food, and clothing, have a comfortable home for Mandy, that's his wife. The folks here calls her Mrs. Anderson. And he knew that his master would never call his wife Mrs. Anderson. And the children, Millie, Jane, and Grundy, go to school and are learning well. As to my freedom, which you say I can have, there is nothing to be gained on that score, as I got my papers in 1864 from the Provost Marshal General of the Department of Nashville and found out that he actually got his freedom papers on the campus of Fisk University, a Black college where I used to teach, which was established to teach the newly freed enslaved people. Mandy said she would be afraid to go back without some proof that you were supposed to treat us justly and kindly. And we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you, reparations. This will make us forget and forgive old scores and rely on your justice. Black folk are always talking about justice throughout our history. No justice, no peace, and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Reparations, repairing the damage. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express. Karen, I think that was like Federal Express back in the day or something. In care of V. Winters, Esquire, Dayton, Ohio. No wonder you wanted them back. The man had hired a lawyer. If you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, we can have little faith in your promises in the future. And then he goes on to end the letter. He says, you should also tell me whether or not there are schools in this Big Spring for the children. And you know that there weren't. And then he says, you will also please state if there would be any safety for my Millie and Jane. Those are his daughters, who are now grown up and both good-looking girls. The reason why he said that, because the first sexual experience of most Black women on plantations was being raped by the white master. And he says that the great desire of my life now is to give my children an education and to protect them and have them form virtuous habits. And he ends the letter by saying, say howdy to George Carter and thank him for taking the pistol from you when you were shooting from me, from your old servant, Jordan Anderson. So that's all I wanted to say, but that is a reflection of the whole need of reparations that Black folk in this country have always talked about, and African people throughout the world, in the form of saying 40 acres and a mule and other ways. Okay. Karen, I'm turning it back to you.
That was absolutely brilliant. It was amazing. Really, really, really informative. I really enjoyed it. We do have some questions here that I'd like to present to you for discussion, Dr. Biocco. The first says, can you speak about systemic racism and violence in our institutions and structures such as jails, prisons, and the mass incarceration of Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color in the US and globally?
Well, you know, one of my former students when I was teaching at Vanderbilt is Michelle Alexander. She's written a book called The New Jim Crow about mass incarceration in the United States. And I would, as psychologists, I think we should all read that. See, when we talk about issues of mass incarceration and the violence in these institutions, Michelle couches it in the history of racism that is just a part of this culture. You know, and it's amazing how we don't talk about racism, you know, frankly, and, you know, in non-oblique ways. You know, like all during this election, for example, I kept hearing, well, he's got to win suburban housewives. Why not just say white women? That's who you're talking about. Or we use terms like inner city, or we use terms like mass incarceration. Mass incarceration, racism, and violence are all knitted together in the penal system. You know, I call it the criminal injustice system. You know, I could talk about police brutality, but I could also talk about disparities in sentencing, who goes to jail for what. The fastest growing rate of incarceration right now in the United States is no longer Black men, it's Black women. What are they going to jail for? They're going to jail for status offenses, money crimes, writing bad checks, and all of that, because the family has been divided because of incarceration of Black men. So, you know, I can't talk, and again, I would recommend Michelle's book. I cannot talk about violence in these institutions unless you talk about racism. And this country wants to avoid that discussion. You're on mute.
There we go.
Okay.
Can you give us the name of that book one more time?
The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Obama, or something like that, by Michelle Alexander.
Michelle Alexander.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Our next question. Can you speak about the racism and colonization of Black people and Indigenous people in the US and globally, and the systemic brainwashing and manipulation of those communities, particularly by Christianity?
Well, you know, I'm really glad you raised that point. See, let me just put it this way, and I know I'm going to probably say something that'll offend anybody, but after this seminar, I'm going home. Okay. White people, or people classified as white, as Francis Welsing said, only comprise 8% of the world's population. Only 8% of the world population are people classified as white. You have to cut that in half between men and women. So really 4% of the world's population are white males. But who is called a minority? Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, Asians. They're referred to as a minority. The most common person on earth is a Chinese citizen. And after that, Native Indians from India, of course. And so I think that what we, you know, like I showed the slide of Stephen Biko, I think how we think about ourselves has been the greatest damage done. And that's one reason why I went into psychology, is the greatest damage is how we think about ourselves. And I'm not just talking about Black people, I'm talking about all types of people of color. People classified as white know they are a minority. They don't like to admit that, and they will call us a minority, but they are the minority. And I think much of their behavior, as Dr. Welsing says, comes from being a minority. See, white people make bad minorities. Black folk know how to act. We know when we walk into a place, you know, where our place is. White people have the need of taking over. We're seeing this right now in the Black Lives Matter movement. I talked to a colleague of mine out in Washington State. They said hardly any Black folk are in the Black Lives Matter movement, which doesn't mean that that's not a good thing. But what it means is that agendas will be shifted and so forth. So I think that the idea of how Black folk have been psychologically damaged, and then we can talk about colonialism, which your person asked about too. The colonized mentality, which has been written about, is when you think that you know, that's when you get into issues of colorism, classism within Black and brown communities all over the world. So it's a deep discussion.
Absolutely, it is. It absolutely is. So our next question, what does solidarity really look like in the field of psychology?
Well, I think has to be an acknowledgement. See, I'm amazed, you know, Toni Morrison gave a series of lectures at Harvard a few years ago. It was called, it's in a book now called Playing in the Dark. If you have a chance to read it, it's a very tiny book that Toni wrote. And see, if I'm white, I can be an expert in American literature if I know Hawthorne, Longfellow, oh, who's some other white boys? You know, all these white people. I don't even have to know anything about James Baldwin. I don't have to know anything about Toni Morrison, you know, or Audre Lorde. I just can be an expert. I think that psychologists, and I'm talking about white psychologists as well, they have to learn about Black folk, Native American folk, Latinos, all of these other groups, Asians, and really get deep. And I don't think you should be an expert in psychology unless you know, have a multitudinal view of the world. I don't like the word multicultural, but you look at the world in a way that understands all people. You know, I teach a course in Black psychology, and when I was teaching at Vanderbilt, one of my white colleagues said to me, he didn't like me using Guthrie's book, Even the Rat Was White, which is a Black history of psychology. And he said, well, what can you know, you're talking about African-centered psychology. What does that have to do with a boy from Mississippi, a Black boy from Mississippi? How can you use, he's not from Africa. I said, well, what does a Viennese psychiatrist named Sigmund Freud have to do with a Black boy from Mississippi? So I think that we, you know, psychologists, in terms of banding together, they really have to understand each other's culture. And a lot of times we don't spend any time doing that.
That absolutely we don't, and I think that is extremely critical. Let me ask you this question: do you think that there is such a thing as, so we know we have Filipino psychology, we have Japanese psychology. Is there a Black psychology?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I'll say it one more time, absolutely. I was one of the people back in the 70s. It was a group of Black psychologists, Wade Nobles, Naeem Akbar, Bobby Wright, Lou Ramey, and so many, Maisha Bennett. And we used to meet in Atlanta at Pascal's Hotel, and we hammered out, which is now called Black psychology. There's several books about it. My colleague Joseph White, the late Joseph White, out in California, has a book about that. So the answer is yes. And Black psychology is merely looking at the world through a Black lens rather than a white lens. That's all it is. And see, it's amazing because psychologists of color, we're asked to do that work. I was doing part-time therapy in Nashville at a mental health center. This is back in the 80s. And it was in a very middle-class white suburban area in Nashville. And these white women were coming to me and saying things like, you know, I don't work and my husband gives me $1,000 a week for an allowance, and I play cards, bridge on Wednesday, and I'm depressed. Well, see, in my community, if you were getting $1,000 a week, you know, and you didn't work, and all you had to do was play spades, you'd be okay. So I had to understand what it was, and this was a big leap. I had to understand what it was to be a white woman in the suburbs in Nashville and being depressed, because I didn't see what she was depressed about or they were depressed about. So I think that we, Black psychologists, have to make that leap. And all I'm asking is for my white colleagues to do the same thing.
So what do you know about transgenerational trauma, which is my specialization, and how that fits into when you're talking about Blacks, the Black diaspora, and mental health, well-being, and reparations to Blacks and Indigenous globally?
Well, it's a very good question, Karen. You know, it's interesting right now, Jewish psychologists are doing a lot of research on epigenetic research on how biologically people change because of trauma. I was just in a session right before this where a Black public health worker is doing research on how issues of blood pressure, diabetes, are passed on and exacerbated by being the person being encountered by racism. So I think that that's globally. I think that we sometimes try to minimize the impact of racism, and sometimes that racism can be very, very subtle of how it is transferred intergenerationally. That study that came out a few months ago, where they said that Black women who have white doctors while they're pregnant are more likely to have problems in pregnancy, as well as give birth to children with birth defects. See, that does, as opposed to having a Black doctor. And we don't want to talk about this stuff because racism is hard to talk about in the United States and abroad, but it does affect us intergenerationally. And that trauma, literally changes our genetics.
Thank you for that. I haven't read that study, so I'm really interested. I actually have a dissertation student that is talking about epigenetics. And yes, I'm really, really interested in that because it really can make a difference in how we treat our patients as medical providers and physicians. Right. So my next question is this. What do you say when Black people or indigenous populations, I think they're more receptive, but Black people who resist the thought process of being traumatized or having operate in a state of trauma?
Well, you mean people that deny race, or is that what you mean? Like people who deny that race exists in their lives?
Well, I believe that, especially in America, and I know this is not about my opinions, but I believe that Black people in America have all been traumatized to some point. And the transgenerational trauma that has occurred and that is continuing to occur, even now, I will find Black people who deny that. I've not been traumatized.
Yeah. Well, you hear a lot of that. What's this woman, Candace Owens? She's a Black person, and I think I put her up on the screen. Or Ben Carson here in this city, that where I live. I think a lot of Black folk are in denial of, racism. It's very similar to how Jewish people often were in denial of anti-Semitism and Nazism right at the beginning of the Holocaust. We want to think that somehow the United States and other governing bodies will somehow transcend race and help us or something like that. And so some people are strong believers in the American dream. And they're Black, and their people are being persecuted. Those are the people that I, in my book Warrior Myth, I call super slaves. That they may be very, very powerful, but there's a denial that racism exists. And how people do that is almost delusional. And it, as far as I'm concerned as a psychologist, it is delusional that we would think and just look around us. And I have not a friend, but a person at Morgan State, when Trump made that comment during the debate about the Proud Boys get ready or whatever he said, well, he could have just been, saying that. I said, you don't think that was racist at all? You don't think that gave a nod to the racism? He said, no. Well, see, I think that, that shows that we oftentimes are in denial about that stuff. It's part of the trauma of being in a racist society. People call it the Stockholm syndrome, where we start really believing that the people who are treating us badly, are somehow okay. And it's, to the detriment of our mental health.
What do you say about those who say that Blacks in America are immigrants?
Well, it's almost like saying that the indigenous people aren't the original inhabitants of the United. See, that's why I talk about studying history. We're not immigrants. We're not interns, which one book in Texas once called us a few years ago. The enslaved people were really interns. I just think that people like that really are in denial. Ta-Nehisi Coates says in his book Between the World and Me that America, until it deals with the issue of reparations, will always have myths about itself. The true believers in the American dream have always been Black folk and immigrants, because those words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. We really believe that. People classified as white, they don't. I saw a president of the United States yesterday say, stop counting. An American president saying something like that. He doesn't believe in the Constitution. Black folk do. We believed in those founding documents like the Declaration of Independence. And we haven't come to grips in this nation about the issue of racism and what we should do about it. And I think the only solution to it is to begin the repair of the damage by implementing reparations.
So I think we have room for a couple of more questions. So I did my research and dissertation down in Australia, where you were, in Perth. Yes. And prior to going down there, their prime minister, I believe his name was Kevin Rudd at the time, issued an apology to the Aboriginals on the continent of Australia. And there was a huge backlash from the white community there. However, the Aboriginals were just overwhelmed by that apology. And it really took the first steps for them to start to regain their own sense of self and repair their mental health. What do you think an apology would do here in the United States for Blacks, indigenous populations, and those people who have been disenfranchised?
Well, believe it or not, there have been apologies for enslavement in this country, but none of them have been linked to reparations. So I think apologies without reparations are hollow. It's like, Karen, if I break out all the windows in your car and I did it, and I walk up to you and I say, Karen, I'm sorry that the windows of your car were broken. And you say, good. Now, could you fix them? And then I said, well, I don't want to fix them. I just want to apologize for them. You want them to be fixed. And until I do something about what I did to you, you're always going to be suspicious of me. You're not going to look at me as being someone as that you can trust. I think, and it's still, the Australians have National Sorry Day to this day. And it's a time for the nation to reflect upon what it did in taking, Aboriginal children away from their homes. That famous movie, Rabbit Proof Fence, illustrates. In fact, I read a couple of days ago that one of the children, the last of those children, just died. She was in her 90s, I believe. And I think that we've got to look at those things. A nation has to ask for forgiveness and then do something about it. Bill Clinton did that with the Tuskegee experiments when he had a ceremony at the White House. But this nation is reluctant to talk about national apologies for enslavement.
So do you think that reparations are really possible today.
Yes. And the reason why I say that, because they're being implemented in Asheville, North Carolina right now. I've helped with the ones that are being instituted in Evanston, Illinois right now. I can't tell you everything, but the next major city that is going to call for reparations and implement them is none other than Washington, D.C. And I'm not free to talk about the details of reparations are going to happen. I think that it's ironic and interesting that Stevie Wonder last weekend, when he was campaigning for Joe Biden, called him out on this, just as he did Ronald Reagan, calling him out to implement a day for Dr. King. So it's going to happen. Actually, I think it's going to happen sooner than we think. So we will see. In California, by the way, Gavin Newsom out there just set up a commission to study reparations. So it's going to happen, and it should happen.
Well, Dr. Biocco, Dr. Winbush, thank you so much for joining us. It looks like we're running out of time. We have just so much more to talk about. We have so much work to do here in America and abroad. Dr. Rami, are you on? She may have left.
Yeah,
But I just want to just
I'm
thank you. Oh, okay, all right.
sorry.
So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Rami. I want to thank you all for being a part of this. Dr. Winbush, please, please, please stay in contact with us. And I want to talk. We need to talk more. And if you have the names of those books that you talked about and those that you showed, if you could send me a list of them. And so if our viewers want a copy of that, I can provide that. Dr. Rami, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk this morning, Dr. Winbush.
Thank
And
you.
thanks to you all for participating. We would love to hear from you in the audience about this webinar. Please provide feedback on your experience about both the content and format of today's discussion. If you registered for APA approved CE, you will receive and must complete that Qualtrics hosted online survey. Please check your spam box if you do not see the Qualtrics survey in your inbox. Remember, your CE certificate will be automatically and instantaneously generated and emailed to you. On behalf of the Division 52 Webinar Committee, enjoy the rest of your day and the upcoming weekend.